Hello, what's going on? It is Doug Cunnington, and this is The Doug Show. In this episode, we will be talking about deep work. And this is part 3 of the productivity series. There are 4 parts, and the next one will be on prioritizing. Just like the other 2 episodes in this series, my wife and I are discussing the topic. So it makes it a little bit more interesting to go back and forth, I hope. And we also get to hear a clip from one of my favorite movies and books, The Shining by Stephen King. So that's at the end. And don't worry, it's actually relevant to the episode in a weird way. And kind of goes to prove that you can relate almost anything to something else if you try hard enough. And I guess a little background I can mention around The Shining and maybe one reason why I like it so much. I remember watching, I like scary movies a reasonable amount. And when I was a kid, I was probably like maybe 10 or 12, something like that. I saw The Shining for the first time, and I don't think I really understood much of it, by the way, at the time. But over time, I have figured out a little bit more. And 1 or 2 cool things around The Shining. Number one, when Stephen King was inspired to write the book, he stayed at a hotel called the Stanley in Estes Park, Colorado. I worked in Estes Park, Colorado, I lived there, I guess, while I worked in the Rocky Mountain National Park for 2 summers back in the early 2000s. And that is kind of cool because that was the first time I was out in Colorado, and that town is only, I think it's like an hour from where we're living now. And just in general, that was sort of like my introduction to the Rocky Mountains, which I've now lived in this zone for a few years. So that's pretty cool. The Stanley Hotel it's a pretty nice hotel. They've been doing some upgrades and some cool stuff in the last couple of years. But even in the early 2000s, it was interesting to go check it out. They have, and I think it's like 100 years old, something like that. No. It was built in like 1907. So it's a little bit older than that. But the point is, it's an old historic hotel, supposedly haunted, and Stephen King stayed at that hotel. I think it was like a couple days or the week that they were closing up for the winter. I guess this would have been like in the early to mid 70s or so. And he and his wife stayed there, and basically it was like them and the hotel staff that was getting it ready to like close up for the winter. So anyway, very cool like story. And then later on, like in the last few years, I read The Shining, which is Stephen King's books are kind of long at times, but great book. And it's interesting because the movie is pretty different from the book, and they just have sort of a different path that they take. So I don't want to reveal anything, even though the book and movie have been out for 40 plus years. But anyway, if you're looking into it, you should check it out. So I'm just rambling on and on at this point. So I'm just going to send it over to the discussion on deep work. We're talking about deep work today and focusing on stuff. Are you a good focuser?
You say I am. I
think you're pretty good at it.
I think you've actually said exceptional.
You exceed expectations.
Oh, fair enough.
For you're focusing. And I think the reason why I say that is I know that either when you're working or even if it's on a project at home where it does require focus, basically it looks like you're able to focus for a lot longer than most other people and keep distractions out. And I think it's gotten harder since we started working with social media and then smartphones and the prevalence of email and all that stuff. But I know that you could focus pretty well just from my observation.
Thank you. How about you? Well, hold on. What does deep work mean? What does that mean?
Well, really just focusing on some sort of a complex, thing for a while. Usually it's sort of a block of time. There's a book by Cal Newport, which is sitting right in front of us, and we'll reference a lot of that. If you haven't read the book, you should, pick it up. It's very interesting. There's a lot of studies and data that help you, believe that deep work is really important. And so that's sort of our loose working definition, focusing on something that requires concentration for, some period of time. Okay. So I think one thing we can, talk about is multitasking, which is sort of like the opposite of deep work. And I know when I had my corporate job, people talked about multitasking all the time. Mainly, they just meant they weren't paying attention to the meeting we were in or whatever. They'd say, hey, sorry, I was multitasking, meaning they were looking at their email or they were on another meeting at the same time, which basically meant you had to waste time and repeat what was already said. And, usually that person got distracted from what they were doing. And there's a couple studies that we could reference, and I'll read one out.
I thought multitasking was supposed to be a good thing. I think I remember growing up and people would be like, you've got to multitask. Like, that's how you're efficient. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. And computers multitask. They're really good at multitasking because, going back to my computer engineering days, like a computer is like dealing with zeros and ones and making like discrete decisions, but we can't do that. We're not computers, and computers were able to basically multi-thread and multitask on different tasks. To be redundant, they were able to multitask and do two things at the same time in between like the clock cycles. So they were like doubling their throughput because they could process more than one thing when other data was processing elsewhere on other chips or something like that. Really bad description, but people can't multitask well. And in fact, there was a 2009 study by Sophie Leroy, I'm not sure, Sophie Leroy, a business professor at the University of Minnesota, and she demonstrated that switching tasks from A to B, our attention stays attached to the first activity, which means you could only half focus on the second, and that obviously hurts your performance. Her experiments utilized two groups. Group A worked on a word puzzle until she interrupted them to go read resumes and make a hypothetical hiring decision. And Group B got to finish their puzzles before moving on to the resumes. And in between the tasks, Leroy would give a quick test to see how many keywords from the puzzles were still stuck in the participants' minds. And as you can imagine, Group A was much more focused on the puzzle and therefore less focused on the task of hiring. So the long and the short of it is that multitasking isn't good for productivity, especially when it's really important to be effective.
I don't know. Reviewing resumes, you're just messing with someone's life, right? Why would you need to focus on that?
Right. And you can imagine, that was in an experiment and all that stuff, but that was pretty controlled. Now we have, if you have a laptop or a computer that you're working on, and then you have a phone with like a bunch of different apps, constant distractions will be coming in. Even if it's something fun, like we have our dog Georgie on Instagram, and we post pictures, and it's fun, right? It's a fun little distraction. Georgie gets to participate a little bit, but basically we ended up with all these notifications just constantly bombarding us. So I turned off, actually at this point, my phone's on do not disturb 24 hours a day. And I only accept calls or text messages from anyone like in my favorites, which it's family members basically. So I'm really trying to get rid of the distractions because they really bogged me down.
Yeah, I remember, I guess we'll get a little bit more into deep work and what it is and how to do it. But I remember when I first started working, I don't know. I think I was surprised at the hours that some of the executives kept and how they would stay until 6:30 or 7, stay later in the day. But as I progressed in my career, I figured out the secret of that. And actually, the reason they stay late is maybe not because they have too much work to do or because, they necessarily want to, but that is the best time of the day to be productive because everyone else is gone and they don't have the distractions of, their teams and the meetings and people like bombarding them all the time. And so, when you are in one of those cycles of work, I have also often heard, people I work with, they'll come in on the weekend and they're like, in 3 hours, I was able to get more work done than I did all week because they were able to have that focus time without the distractions of everything else.
Yep. And I kind of like the morning period versus the evening because in the evening, some people would work later and could distract you. But in the morning, usually it's like a ghost town. Now, that sort of stuff has kind of gone away with like remote working and the time zones sort of overlap. So I know while towards the end of my corporate gig, I ended up the day would start much earlier because there were, other people in other time zones who were already up, and then it would last longer, depending on where you were located because of that. But yeah, that's a great point. And actually it reminds me, there was a mentor of mine who, he had a really rough stretch. He was working on long projects and ended up, working 80, 100-hour weeks, at least that's what he would say. And Elizabeth, you and I have talked, you really can't work that many hours in the day. You can't really get anything done. He was really spending his time sending emails and on meetings that he would just sit on the phone in meetings just in case, not actually doing anything productive. The point being, really, you can only do a few hours of deep work. You have to do some other lower intensity activities. Email is a good example. So we're getting kind of into the tactics a little bit, but we'll break it down more later. I mean, I will usually try and do a piece of the quote deep work, maybe only a couple times a week. And then later in the afternoon, that's when I'll do email, or at least I'll try my best to save the sort of activities that don't need a lot of concentration for later in the day. That way I could just more quickly get through those and save my brain power for the earlier part of the day.
All right. So if you're one of those people out there that thinks you might struggle with deep work and distractions, how do we do it, Doug?
There are a couple approaches that Cal Newport talks about in deep work, and we'll talk about those 4. But the core of any of them is to eliminate distractions. And there are some apps you could put on your laptop to turn off internet access for however long you want. I think there's one called Freedom, and you could say, I want 90 minutes of freedom and internet access turns off. There's not a way to turn it back on, I think. Unless, I don't know how to get through it. But the point is it turns off internet access. And then if you're thinking, hey, what if I have to do research? Just take a note and you could look it up later. But the point is you're disconnected and you won't get distracted. Another tactic I heard from Neil Strauss, a New York Times bestseller, he has his wife turn on the parental controls on his machine, and he doesn't know the password, so he only has internet access at from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. And he was saying he never answered emails so quickly. You get through what you have to when you have 1 hour to get it done. So that's a really effective way to prioritize because you only hit the most important stuff.
That sounds pretty extreme. It sounds like he can't be trusted. He's got to be locked out.
Yeah. And he was I don't know the password. So if there's an emergency, I have to find my wife to unlock it. But I mean, that's effective. And I can't remember if it was Neil Strauss also, but, one thing you could do, put your phone on airplane mode. I think I've heard some people put it in a box in another room across the house. So it's super inconvenient to go over to get it, or in another spot in your office or something like that. That way, you're not going to pick up your phone and like go over to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever may be distracting you. So that's like the core of some of the ideas. Do you have any like sort of high level tips before I go over the 4 methods here?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to step on your toes because I don't really know the methods, but I was doing a little research, and creating a plan was a big thing that they said. You can't really deep work if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, which makes sense. Having a specific goal in mind. You got to know what you want to do. I think that's maybe where I'm really good. I'm good at planning out my time, and I know what I need to get done. Some would say I'm too good. Doug once said the most annoying thing about me was my excessive planning, but maybe that's why I can focus.
Right. And I think, there's a time and place for all that planning. So maybe when you're on vacation, you want to have a little bit more spontaneity.
But then
we'll save that for later.
But then how will you know you're having as much fun as you possibly could?
Yeah, you got to schedule the fun in there. We should be having more fun right now.
Yeah, it's the time you're having the time of your life. And before Doug goes into the tactics, if talking about the problem with distractions, we'll put this in the show notes. There's a great scene in The Shining, which we just watched over the Halloween season, also known as October, scary movie month for us. But there's a great scene in The Shining where Wendy comes in and distracts Jack while he's trying to write, and it doesn't go very well, and he gives her a nice little speech about it. So,
all right, let's get into the 4 ideas that Cal Newport lays out in Deep Work. Again, go check out the book if you want to get like all the details behind it. The first one he talks about is the monastic approach here. And that is like a monk, you could imagine. So you eliminate all distractions and you just kind of buckle down. Again, like Elizabeth said, for all of these, you need to know what you're working on. You can't just like eliminate all distractions and then try and do any of these. And you're still going to have trouble if you don't know what you're supposed to work on. So we'll go through them all and then we'll sort of say like what we think we end up doing. So monastic is first. The second one is bimodal. So that idea is around clearly defining like a long period of time to do the work, and then the rest is generally free, and you can sort of like fill in with those lower intensity activities that don't require as much concentration. So you could kind of think of that as, maybe you do 1 or 2 days a week where you're really focusing on like deep work, and then the rest of the time is, less structured. Number 3 is rhythmic, and that is blocks of times, maybe like 90 minutes at a time, and then you take a break for a little while before you go back and do another 90-minute block. Of course, 90 minutes is arbitrary. You could pick however much time you want. The other portion that's important is to like track it with a calendar, so you're hitting 4 days a week where you're doing these blocks for 4 hours a day or something like that to give you 3 hours of work. Last, number 4 is the journalistic approach, and this one is like a reporter, right? A journalist. They are on like tight time constraints. They work whenever they can, and I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but like reporters and anyone working at a newspaper, you don't get writer's block because you have to write to get it to your editor so that you can publish on a deadline. So they're just used to having like being able to produce, and that's the word, right? They don't really get writer's block because they don't have time to procrastinate. So those are the 4. What approach do you think you have?
I am the third. What was that again?
Rhythmic. Yes,
I'm a rhythmic deep worker because I find it to be kind of draining. Like if you actually really are focusing and concentrating on a task and giving it your full attention, I get up and take breaks. So I definitely think, I'll plan out my day and I'll be like, all right, I'm going to, try to get this done by 10:15, and then I'm going to take a break and take a little walk, clear my head, come back, maybe do some lower level tasks, and then like set up the next round of, review or whatever I need to do for later that afternoon. Monastic. I mean, I think the reason that's called monastic, like only the monks can do that, right? I mean, how can you live all the time, your whole life without any distractions? That kind of is unrealistic, I think, for most people.
I think you would have to do it for periods of time. So maybe you could do it for 2 weeks and really get something done. And for example, Cal Newport, he's not on social media. He's like a CS at Georgetown. He's a CS professor at Georgetown. And you would think he'd be like high tech and like on social media a bunch, but he is not on social media. He got rid of it a while ago. And he gives a couple sort of extreme examples in the book of people who they don't have email. Like they're like, I'm not going to do email. And if you want to get in touch with me, you got to find another way. And there's some ways to do it. But I mean, one of them is a college professor. Like, can you imagine like at this point in time, not having an email and you're a college professor? I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's pretty odd. That reminds me, one of the ladies I worked with, over a decade ago, she just was like, I don't do email. And this was like an executive. And it was weird back then, but she's like, I don't answer my emails. I don't do email. If you need something from me, find another way to get in touch with me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I can't focus as well as Elizabeth. I'm not as disciplined and stuff, especially now that I'm working for myself. I tend to be more scattered. There's a lot more distractions, but I think I fall between the bimodal and the rhythmic is what it's called. So if I could do a better job, it would probably be closer to the bimodal, so I can get, say, 4 hours of something that I really have to concentrate on. Sometimes it may take me, 20 or 30 or 40 minutes to get in the right mindset to, say, write something. Like it may take me just a little while to fire on all cylinders, depending on what it is. I think other times I have to do the rhythmic approach where like I need to focus for a bit. I have to take a break, and then maybe I have to do some of the low intensity activities depending on what's going on in my workday. So I think ideally I would love to do the monastic approach. And I think if I've had a big piece of work, like that is what I do. I like remove distractions maybe for a few days. And I think for me, sometimes it may take like 20 or 30 minutes to get in the right mode. But if I could make it stick around for a few days, if I'm, say, writing something really long, like an 80-page like book or something like that, I could really get a lot done like day over day. So the monastic approach is really good. Now,
see, and what's interesting is I think I might have pegged you as more journalistic. I think you tend to really pump it into gear when you've got a deadline like right in front of you.
You know what? I didn't even think of that. I was thinking like more ideally, but you're right. When I do have a deadline, I can sit and work for 12 hours straight.
Yep.
That's true. I forgot.
I think probably, wouldn't you say most people are a combination of all of those?
Most likely. I think the four things, the four methods here are without any constraints, like they're just approaches. But the reality is everyone has constraints. So one of the exercises or examples in the book is around time blocking, where basically you schedule your day in 30-minute blocks, and it's going to be real messy at first because most people, especially me, underestimate how much time it takes to do things. And your schedule will change. Things will happen that you can't control. So probably every day something is going to change. So there's a few pieces that make it hard to do, but if you can stick with it, a few things will happen. So I'm really bad at estimating how long it takes to do things. And like when you write it down and you're like, okay, I need to move on to the next thing, and you realize you're only a quarter of the way done, then you have to figure out how to estimate better. So you'll get better at estimating how long things take. The other thing is you'll realize because of that, you should probably just leave like gap in your schedule. So schedule a certain amount of time, leave some gap in there. And if you finish something early, well, you can do those sort of lower level activities, admin tasks, bookkeeping, sending emails, whatever. If you finish early, you could just move on to something else or take a break, which is good. In fact, in the book, it talks about being bored and like being able to work through ideas because you're bored, because you're not constantly thinking, trying to solve something. So
I saw that as well in my research, and I liked that tip. I also liked it. It was said something like scheduling time to think. And when I have had difficult problems that I'm working over, that is something that I actually do well. I literally will just go like sit outside somewhere and think. Or I think the example I found was take a walk and let your mind, mull over that problem. And so, in this day and age, maybe sometimes when we think about like deep work, you're sitting in front of a computer, either writing or, analyzing a spreadsheet or doing something like that. Sometimes just thinking is actually the work.
Yep. And you got to let your brain have time to solve those problems, especially, if it was an obvious solution, you probably would have thought of it already. So you'll have to sort of mull over it and stuff. And the other thing with the scheduling and the fact that, if you're time blocking your day in 30-minute increments, like it's going to change. So you just have to deal with it. And it's not a waste of time to schedule the time blocks. It's just if something changes, if someone is unavailable to meet when they said, then you'll probably just need to shuffle things around. And the way that Cal Newport does it in the book, basically you get a sheet of paper, you put your initial schedule on the left side, and then if something changes, you could just reschedule it on the right side. So you just have to deal with it. And it's, like I said, not a waste of time to schedule it. It's just going through the exercise helps you in various ways and helps you get the work done.
So something else I found when I was researching about this time blocking, I don't know what I thought about this, but they called it the 20% less rule. Does he talk about that?
Not that I recall.
So it's like if you think you're going to need an hour to do something, schedule 20% less time. So schedule 48 minutes. That was some quick math in my head there. I believe it's correct. But schedule 20% less, and then that will like kick you into deep work and working harder because you thought it was going to take an hour, but you're only giving yourself 48 minutes. I don't know how I felt about that.
Right. I like the idea of it's like Parkinson's law or something like that, where you're like the work will expand to the amount of time or contract to the amount of time that you have. But if you're like me and you like chronically underestimate stuff, well, then my whole schedule would be fucked because then I would underestimate it and then I wouldn't have enough time.
But I liked it said adding a sense of urgency to the task is like doing interval training for your mind.
Nice. Interval training for the mind.
Yes. I don't know. This is a new concept to me, but I thought that was like maybe once you feel better about your estimating, it's sort of like that horrible product I told you about for the shower. This is the worst product ever. So it's like a timer for your shower and it starts out at like 10 minutes and then slowly so you get out of the shower when the light turns red or something like that. And then slowly over time, it'll cut like 15 seconds off your shower. And so, then you're taking 5-minute showers. I'm like, that's the worst.
That is bad
product ever. But like to slowly wean yourself into like showering faster. Sorry. I know that's not deep work, but like, sort of like the interval training for your mind. You like train yourself to do things faster.
I have two great thoughts on that. So they should also make the water get colder towards the end of the shower. So you're like, I got to get out of here.
This
is fucking freezing here.
That's a horrible thing. What else?
The other thing is great ideas come in the shower. So why would you want to limit that time?
Oh, that is good thinking time. You're right. Yeah.
So
no distractions, no phone in the shower.
Right.
You don't take your phone in the shower, do you?
No.
Is it waterproof?
It is waterproof, but no, I don't.
Yeah.
In fact, I was going to say, I heard, I can't remember who it was. They were saying that they got like an Amazon Echo or Alexa or whatever it's called, so that they can like schedule stuff and like, I guess like listen to music and get the weather while they're in the shower. Like, so they could like yell to Alexa, "Hey Alexa, pass the soap."
I don't want to judge anyone, but that's weird. You sure that's not someone whose wife was just named Alexa?
I don't think so. I have also seen it's like a shower curtain with a little pouch on the outside where you could set your phone in there and then like control it through the clear plastic.
No.
So you could like watch YouTube videos or maybe listen to actually send us a note if you're listening to this while you're showering or bathing.
Okay. To each their own. To each their own.
Yeah, I guess so. I have listened to music in the shower before.
Yeah, back in like the 80s, it was a big deal to have one of those suction cup shower radios or whatever, getting the FM. Yeah.
I guess so.
That's what that's what people our age call it, the FM.
The FM. Nice. Yeah. All right. Any other tips on deep work or focusing?
No. I haven't read the book, but it sounds interesting. And I'm also always intrigued whenever Doug says I do something very well, because the compliments from Doug are few and far between. So,
okay. So here is one thing that I wanted to point out. So let's say you're like, I do need to improve on my deep work and schedule it. And let's say you're in. That's great. However, and this is a quote, so I'm just going to read it out. So the ability to concentrate intensely is a skill that must be trained. This idea might sound obvious once it's pointed out, but it represents a departure of how most people understand such matters. In my experience, it's common to treat undistracted concentration as a habit, like flossing, something that you know how to do and you know is good for you, but you've been neglecting it due to the lack of motivation. This is Doug talking again. We both floss every day, so just want to make that clear for the record if my dentist is listening. Okay, back to the quote here. This mindset is appealing because it implies you can transform your working life from distracted to focused overnight if you can simply muster the motivation. But that understanding ignores the difficulty of focus and the hours of practice necessary to strengthen your mental muscle. The creative insights, blah, blah, blah. So basically, you can't just flip a switch and say, hey, I'm going to start concentrating for 4 hours a day if you're used to only doing 2 hours a day. And I think this perhaps is where you and I can excel. Like I said, I can literally sit down. I can't do it every day, but I could sit down and work for many hours straight, taking a few breaks, and you can try and talk to me, right? I think you have tried to walk in my office while I'm working. And you'll come in here and you'll ask me a question and I just don't talk. And I've done the same to you where you're doing something and I'll come up and just try and ask you something. And it's like you're not even like you're in another world. It's like we've shut out like external distractions. And I think for me, I mean, I had to do a lot of deep work in college. And I don't know if you had to do a ton of that. I think I had to work harder in college because my brain's smaller than Elizabeth's.
Okay, so I actually, as you brought that up, I was thinking, I do have one tip. If you're going to try and do deep work at home or somewhere where other people are around, spouses, kids, whatever, it'd be good to communicate that to them and come up with some sort of plan. Because, as Doug said, I will come in and talk to him. And I have gotten some rather terse replies a few times because he's in the middle of deep work and I've distracted him and now he has to start all over, which is fine. I understand, but you can't expect someone to know that that's what you're doing. So for a while I was like, can I talk? Hey, can I talk to you right now?
And boom, already distracted, even exactly. If you do that.
So if there's like a place in the house where, when you're in that place, everyone knows that they should leave you alone unless it's an emergency. But like communicate that with people that you're trying to do because it's not very fair to yell at your loved ones if they just want to be your friend and they don't realize that you're in the middle of quote unquote deep work. And I think we should put a sign up on the door, because sometimes Doug is in here just goofing off. I'll be honest. He is. He's just in here goofing off, checking his Instagram accounts or whatever. So how do I know like when I can talk to him and when I can't? I guess I can just never talk to him. So that's where we've fallen. This is our one conversation for the week right here. And then he's going back monastic.
Right. I thought we had
That's why he shaves his head too. He can't be distracted by hair. No way.
That's right. I thought we had like the dorm room, like sort of system where I put a sock on the doorknob and then,
I know you're in there with a girl.
I'm working.
Oh, sorry. But yeah, that's my one tip. It just, if you're going to try some of this stuff at certain times, just involve other people if they're going to be around you so they know, and then they can help. And that's a way to minimize your distractions.
All right. So just a quick recap. So you can try and time block your schedule. Like I said, it's going to be rough. It's going to be sloppy. You're going to make mistakes, but if you power through it, you'll get better. That too is a skill. The other thing is, set yourself up for success by limiting distractions. Figure out what your distractions are, whether they are family members or dogs like Georgie, who actually distracts me all day long. She'll come up and put her cute little face on my lap, and she's like, "Come on, take me for a walk." So you got to figure that out. Figure out how to turn that on Do Not Disturb. Yeah, there's no Do Not Disturb on Georgie. But I'm losing focus here right now. The other thing you could do, so limit distractions, and focusing is a skill. You may need to, work yourself up from, a 20-minute focus session to, longer sessions, and it'll take time. It's not just a decision. It's a skill you have to develop.
I'm not sure if this will stay in, but here is the audio of the great clip about deep work from The Shining.
How's it going? Get a lot written today?
Yes.
Hey, weather forecast said it's going to snow tonight.
What do you want me to do about it?
Oh, come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later on with a couple of sandwiches for you, and maybe you'll let me read something then.
Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah?
Fine. And we're going to make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing. Whether you don't hear me typing, what the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. Now, do you think you can handle that?
Yeah.
Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Okay.
That was Jack Torrance, the original deep worker there. Yeah, so if you haven't checked out The Shining, you should watch it. It's a classic movie. And funny thing is, that's not like it's not supposed to be like a funny scene or anything. In fact, most of the movie is pretty dramatic, and it's a bit of a thriller, a psychological thriller, but now that I'm like stepping back and thinking how hilarious we thought that clip was in relation to deep work, it makes me wonder about myself because, he's going crazy there. But anyway, it's a fine movie, and little known fact, actually it's more well known than I realized, but another classic movie was partially filmed in the Stanley Hotel, which I mentioned before, out of Estes Park, Colorado. And that is actually another one of my favorite movies, the classic movie with Jim Carrey, Dumb and Dumber. It's Jim Carrey and what was the other guy? Not Jeff Bridges. Is that who it was? I'll have to check on that. I want to make sure I get it right here. It was Jeff Daniels. Jeff Bridges is the dude from The Big Lebowski. So anyway, Dumb and Dumber, another one of my just favorite movies. And they filmed like the external hotel shot. That is the Stanley Hotel. And I imagine some people are going to Google and check out the Stanley. You'll be able to recognize it right away. And they also filmed like the bar scene inside the little restaurant and bar, which turns out is an excellent, super awesome whiskey bar. Very huge selection. And I mean, there's whiskeys that you probably wouldn't have heard of unless you're, really into it, which I'm not necessarily, but I can enjoy some, dark liquor. So anyway, back to deep work a little bit. And when you put all of the things together that we've talked about in the productivity parts 1 and 2, and then today, a lot of it is like sitting down, doing the work that you're supposed to do, and not getting distracted by all the things that can distract you, whether it's, things that you bring upon yourself with social media, or maybe you have your phone next to you and it's constantly buzzing and notifications are popping up, which at this point in time, I've basically turned off like all notifications. I don't accept phone calls basically unless you're on my favorites list. So not even if you're in my phone book, but I only accept it if it's like an immediate family member. And if you don't leave a message, then I end up blocking your number. There's so many like robocalls out there. But the point is, I've realized like how susceptible I am to, being distracted. And like I said, your phone is just, it's so hard because it's critical, it's critical in a lot of ways. And I use it as a tool and as a productivity device. But at the same time, double-edged sword. I mean, because of all those capabilities, it's like you're hyper connected. So yeah, if you could limit distractions, usually you're going to be better off. You're going to be able to get more things done. And generally, without those distractions, it may take a couple of days to sort of detox, but you end up like feeling just calmer and less stressed. And I've definitely felt that. Part of I listen to a ton of podcasts, right? I go through spells, and sometimes I listen to 3-4 podcasts in a day, depending on, what I have going on that day. And then it may go a week or two, once I get sort of overloaded and I'm like, what, I need some time to think. Today was a day like that. And I actually walked Georgie this morning for about an hour, didn't have any headphones on. And we just walked outside because it was nice, and other days I may be listening to an audiobook, and this is just stream of consciousness going on right now. But podcasts are great. I'm glad you're listening right now. However, I also highly encourage you to check out audiobooks because they are a little bit more polished, as you can imagine. And all the content has gone through a, pretty rigid editing process. So it's a little bit more refined. So I believe, not 100% of the time, but I believe most of the time, if you listen to an audiobook, you're going to have like higher quality information going into your brain versus, podcasts. You may have someone like me who is, hopped up on caffeine, rambling about something that may or may not be related. And in fact, right now, I don't even know how I'm going to end this sentence. So with an audiobook, the narrator, they know how they're going to end the sentence because they've gone through all that long editing process. So I think maybe that is the signal for the end of the show. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget, there's one more part in this productivity series on prioritizing. So, like I said, when you put it all together, it's like, don't get distracted. But like, if you could do all the things that we've talked about, you still got to figure out what you're going to work on. What is the highest priority thing? Because if you don't, you could still end up not where you want to be. So we will catch you next time. Tell a friend about the show. I would really appreciate it. And have a great day.